In the kingdom of Omah Nnadi, there ruled a king named Donatus. His reign was marked by his unwavering sense of justice, fairness, and impartial judgment. The people respected and admired him, for under his rule, the kingdom flourished in peace and prosperity. The king was a man who took pride in his reputation and the legacy he would leave behind. He had a beautiful daughter, Princess Alina, who is known far and wide for her grace and beauty. She was the jewel of the kingdom. However, despite her beauty, Princess Alina suffered from a mysterious and heartbreaking misfortune. Whenever she dressed in her most elegant gowns, adorned with jewels and fine silks, and stepped outside the palace, the people of the kingdom saw not her beauty, but a sight most tragic, a half-naked princess. No matter what she wore, the people only ever saw her as if she were dressed in rags. They mocked her, laughed at her, and spoke cruel words that pierced her heart. Every time she ventured outside, she would return home in tears, humiliated and broken. Her mother, Queen Clara, would comfort her as best she could, holding her daughter close and wiping away her tears. But despite her efforts, Queen Clara could not understand the cause of her daughter's suffering. King Donatus, on the other hand, was furious. He could not comprehend why his daughter, the princess of the land, would be the subject of such ridicule. Rather than seeking to understand the cause of Alina's plight, the king was consumed with anger and concern for his reputation. "Stay indoors," he would shout at her. "You are bringing shame to my name and tarnishing the image of my throne." These harsh words only deepened Alina's sorrow. She longed to be loved and accepted by her people, but instead, her father chose to shout at her and told her to stay indoors, instead of finding the solution to her problem, her heart heavy with grief. What the king did not know was that the source of Alina's misfortune was his own hidden sin. Many years ago, Donatus had made a grave mistake. He had wronged an old, popular beggar woman known as Charity, who cursed the king, declaring that the beauty of his bloodline would be hidden from the world, a curse that would pass on to his descendants. As time passed, the curse took root in Princess Alina, manifesting in the twisted perception that others had of her. While she was truly a vision of beauty, the curse caused all who looked upon her to see only shame and mockery. After many sleepless nights and countless tears, Queen Clara could no longer bear to see her daughter, Princess Alina, suffer. The sight of her beloved child weeping, her spirit crushed under the weight of cruel mockery, pained the queen deeply. Determined to find a solution, she decided to seek help from a man of God, a revered prophet known for his wisdom and powerful prayers. One morning, Queen Clara left the palace and made her way to the humble dwelling of the prophet. She explained her daughter's plight, her voice heavy with desperation. The man of God listened intently, his eyes filled with compassion. He prayed earnestly, asking for divine intervention to lift the curse that plagued the princess. After a time, he looked up at Queen Clara and said, "The Lord has heard your plea. Your daughter is healed. Her suffering has ended. Go home with joy in your heart, for the curse is no more." Queen Clara was overjoyed. She thanked the prophet profusely, her heart lightened by his words. With renewed hope, she hurried back to the palace, eager to share the good news with Princess Alina. When she arrived, she found Alina in her chambers, staring out of the window with a wistful look in her eyes. "My dear," the queen said, her voice brimming with happiness, "your suffering is over. The man of God has prayed for you, and he has assured me that you are healed. You are free to go anywhere you wish, and the people will no longer see you as half-naked. They will finally see you as you truly are." Princess Alina's eyes widened with hope and excitement. "Truly, mother?" she asked, barely daring to believe it. When Queen Clara nodded, Alina could hardly contain her joy. She immediately began preparing to go out, choosing the finest regal attire she owned. A gown of deep crimson silk, embroidered with gold thread and adorned with pearls and gemstones. As she dressed, her heart swelled with the anticipation of finally being seen for who she truly was, without the cruel distortion of the curse. With her head held high, Princess Alina stepped out of the palace and made her way to the village street. She walked with grace and confidence, eager to see the smiles and admiration she had longed for. But as she moved among the people, she noticed something was terribly wrong. The villagers, instead of gazing at her in admiration, began to whisper and snicker. Some pointed, others laughed openly, and Alina's heart sank as she realized that nothing had changed. Once again, the villagers saw her as half-naked, her regal attire invisible to their eyes. The mockery returned, louder and more cruel than ever. Devastated, Alina fled back to the palace, her earlier joy crushed beneath the weight of despair. She burst into her mother's chambers, tears streaming down her face. "Mother," Alina sobbed, "they still see me as half-naked. The people laughed at me, just as they always have. The prayer did not work." Queen Clara was stunned. She had been so certain that the man of God's prayer would bring the healing they so desperately sought. She embraced her daughter, trying to soothe her as Alina wept in her arms. "How can this be?" the queen whispered to herself, her heart heavy with confusion and sorrow. She had placed her faith in the prophet's words, but the curse had not been lifted. She felt the weight of helplessness settling over her, unsure of where to turn next. Unbeknownst to Queen Clara, the curse that plagued Princess Alina was not something that could be lifted by prayer alone. It was bound to the unresolved sin of King Donatus, a wrong that had never been acknowledged or atoned for, continued to torment the innocent princess. Queen Clara realized that they needed to seek another way, something deeper than just a prayer, to uncover the true cause of Alina's suffering. But the road to healing would not be easy, and it would require the king to finally face the truth he had long ignored. A few days after Princess Alina's heartbreaking return from the village, word of her misfortunes spread throughout the kingdom. The situation had become so dire that even the kingdom's most respected chiefs, the members of King Donatus' inner circle of advisors, could not ignore it any longer. These wise and experienced men, known as the cabinet chiefs, had long been trusted by the king to guide him in matters of great importance. One afternoon, the chiefs gathered at the palace, their faces solemn with concern. They requested an audience with the king to discuss the matter that had troubled them deeply. When they were ushered into the grand hall, the king sat on his throne, his expression as stern and resolute as ever. "What is it that brings you here with such urgency?" the king asked, though he already had an inkling of what they might say. One of the chiefs turned to the king and said, "Your Majesty, we come to you with heavy hearts," he began. "We have seen Princess Alina in the village, and we cannot deny what we witnessed. The people see her as half-naked, no matter how finely she dresses. This matter has brought great distress to the kingdom, and we believe something must be done." The other chiefs nodded in agreement, their expressions grave. "Your Majesty," another chief spoke up, "it is clear that this is not just a matter of appearances. There is something deeper at work here, something that needs to be uncovered and resolved. We urge you to deliberate with us on how to free your daughter from this curse." The king listened to their words, but instead of considering their advice, his face darkened with anger. He had already warned his daughter not to leave the palace, yet she had disobeyed him. The thought of his reputation being tarnished by this ongoing scandal filled him with rage. "You speak of resolving this matter," King Donatus said, his voice rising with frustration, "but the solution is simple. The princess should never have left the palace." I have warned her time and time again to stay indoors, yet she continues to defy my orders. It is her stubbornness that brings shame upon this kingdom, not some curse." The chiefs exchanged uneasy glances. They had hoped to reason with the king, to help him see that this was not a problem that could be solved by simply hiding the princess away, but it was clear that the king was too blinded by his own pride to listen. Without waiting for the chiefs to respond, the king stormed out of the grand hall, his footsteps echoing angrily through the corridors of the palace. He made his way to Princess Alina's chambers, his anger boiling over with each step. When he arrived, he found her sitting by the window, her eyes red from crying. "Why did you leave the palace?" the king shouted, his voice filled with fury. "I have warned you to stay indoors and stop bringing shame to my name and my throne. How many times must I tell you this?" Princess Alina looked up at her father, her heart breaking all over again. The tears that had dried on her cheeks began to flow anew. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, "why you only care about your reputation? Why are you not concerned about what is happening to me? I am your daughter, and I am suffering. Can't you see that?" But the king was too consumed by his anger to hear the pain in her voice. "Your suffering is of your own making," he snapped. "If you had obeyed me and stayed indoors, none of this would be happening. You are bringing disgrace upon this family, and I will not allow it to continue." With that, the king turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Princess Alina collapsed onto her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. She could not understand why her father, the man who was supposed to protect and care for her, was so indifferent to her suffering. All he seemed to care about was his reputation, while she was left to endure the torment of the curse alone. Little did King Donatus know that it was his own sin that had brought this curse upon his daughter. The wrong he had committed years ago, the harsh and heartbreaking words he had inflicted on an innocent old beggar, had set in motion the chain of events that now caused his daughter's suffering. But instead of finding solution to his daughter's problem, the king chose to turn a blind eye, preferring to protect his image rather than his own flesh and blood. As the days passed, the situation grew more dire. The cabinet chiefs continued to press the king to take action, but he refused to listen. Princess Alina remained confined to the palace, her spirit crushed under the weight of her father's anger and her own despair. And the curse, born from the king's sin, continued to fester, its grip on the princess tightening with each passing day. Queen Clara was desperate. She had tried everything she could think of to lift the mysterious curse that plagued her beloved daughter, Princess Alina. Despite visiting several men of God and offering countless prayers, nothing seemed to work. The princess continued to suffer, her beauty twisted by the curse into a source of mockery and shame. The queen's heart ached to see her daughter in such pain, and the king's indifference only deepened her sorrow. One day, in a moment of despair, Queen Clara decided to visit an old friend, Queen Seraphina, who ruled a neighboring kingdom. The two queens had known each other for years, and Clara hoped that confiding in Seraphina might bring some comfort or perhaps a new perspective on her daughter's suffering. When she arrived at Queen Seraphina's palace, she was welcomed with open arms, and soon they were seated in Seraphina's private chambers, where Clara poured out her heart. "My dear friend," Queen Clara said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know what to do anymore. My daughter, Princess Alina, is suffering from a curse that makes her appear half naked to everyone who sees her. No matter how beautifully she dresses, the people only see her shame. We have prayed, we have fasted, we have sought the help of holy men, but nothing has changed. I fear for her, and I don't know how much more she can bear." Queen Seraphina listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. She had heard rumors of Princess Elena's plight but had never imagined it was so severe. "This is indeed a heavy burden," Seraphina replied, "but perhaps there is still hope. I know of a powerful prophetess who lives in my kingdom not far from here. She is known for her deep insight and her ability to reveal hidden truths. Perhaps she can help you find the answers you seek." Queen Clara's eyes lit up with hope. "Thank you, Seraphina. If there is even the slightest chance that this prophetess can help my daughter, I must see her." Without delay, the two queens set out for the prophetess's home. They reached a small, humble dwelling nestled among the trees. The prophetess, an elderly woman with wise, piercing eyes, welcomed them inside, after offering them a place to sit. She listened carefully as Queen Clara recounted the long and painful journey she had been on to find a cure for her daughter's affliction. When Clara finished, the prophetess nodded thoughtfully. She closed her eyes and began to pray, seeking guidance from the divine. The room grew still, the air thick with anticipation. After some moments, the prophetess opened her eyes, and what she revealed sent chills down Queen Clara's spine. "Your daughter's suffering," the prophetess began, her voice low and solemn, "is the result of a long-forgotten sin. Many years ago, when King Donatus was much younger and Princess Elena was still a baby, something terrible happened. It was on a cool evening, as the king walked by the village road. He encountered an old beggar woman named Charity, a poor soul who had neither child nor family to care for her. She was known throughout the kingdom for her tattered clothing and destitute appearance. Charity approached the king, hoping for a morsel of food or a kind word. But instead of offering her compassion, King Donatus spoke to her with cruelty. He said, "Everyone in this kingdom knows you as a poor beggar, but is that why you look tattered and half-naked? Don't you know I am the king of this land? Before you approach me, or even dare to speak to me, you must look decent and cover your body. Never disturb my peace again, or I will banish you from this kingdom. Get out of my way, you poor witch." These words, harsh and unkind, broke the old woman's heart. In her despair, she placed a curse upon the king, saying, "As you have judged me for my appearance, so too shall your daughter be judged. No matter how beautiful her garments, the people will see her as half-naked." "A reflection of the cruelty in your heart," Queen Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had never known this dark chapter of her husband's past. She glanced at Queen Seraphina, who was equally stunned by the revelation. The prophetess continued, her voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "This curse has followed your daughter ever since," the prophetess said. "It is not her fault, but the consequence of her father's sin. To break this curse, King Donatus must seek forgiveness. He must find a way to atone for the harm he caused to the memory of Charity and to his own daughter, who suffers because of his actions." Queen Clara sat in stunned silence, the prophetess's words echoing in her mind. She now understood the root of her daughter's suffering, but she also knew that convincing King Donatus to face his past and seek redemption would be no easy task. The king's pride and concern for his reputation had blinded him for so long, and she feared how he would react to this revelation. But despite her fears, Queen Clara knew she had to try. For the sake of her daughter, she would confront the king and make him see the truth. Only then could the curse be lifted, and Princess Elena finally be free from the burden she had carried for so long. With a heavy heart, Queen Clara thanked the prophetess for her wisdom and began the journey back to her kingdom, determined to save her daughter, no matter the cost. As Queen Clara and her friend Queen Seraphina prepared to leave the prophetess's dwelling, the elderly woman, with her wise and piercing eyes, stopped them. "There is more," the prophetess said gravely. The old beggar woman, Charity, has long since passed away. Her spirit lingers in unrest because of the cruelty she endured. To lift the curse upon your daughter, the king himself must go to her grave and make amends. An appeasement must be made. Only then will the curse be broken, and Princess Alina will be free. Queen Clara's heart sank. The task ahead seemed even more daunting than before. Not only would King Donatus need to face the truth of his past, but he would also have to humble himself and perform an act of penance at the grave of the woman he wronged. Knowing her husband's pride, Clara could only imagine the difficulty of convincing him to take such a step. She felt the weight of the task ahead bearing down on her, knowing that everything now rested on King Donatus's willingness to atone for his sin. The queens made their journey back to their kingdoms in silence, the revelation hanging heavily in the air. Queen Clara's mind raced, wondering how she could break the news to her husband and make him understand that this was the only way to save their daughter. When she arrived at the palace, Clara immediately sought out the king. She found him in the royal chambers, pacing in frustration. He was still upset about the chief's complaints and the ongoing mockery of Princess Alina. Without wasting any time, Queen Clara gently but firmly asked him to sit and listen. "Donatus," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I have learned the truth about our daughter's suffering. It is not her fault, nor is it a simple curse. The prophetess I visited has revealed that Alina's condition is a direct result of something you did many years ago." The king's brow furrowed in confusion and defensiveness. "What are you talking about, Clara? How can this be my fault?" Queen Clara took a deep breath and told him everything. The beggar woman Charity, the cruel words he had spoken, and the curse she had placed on their daughter. She recounted the prophetess's revelation that only an appeasement at Charity's grave, made by the king himself, could lift the curse. King Donatus stood silent for a moment, his face a mix of shock, guilt, and anger. "This is absurd," he finally spat. "That was years ago. A mere beggar woman cannot curse the royal family. Do you expect me, the king, to grovel at the grave of some long-dead beggar?" Without wasting any time, Queen Clara gently but firmly asked him to sit and listen. "Donatus," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I have learned the truth about our daughter's suffering. It is not her fault, nor is it a simple curse. The prophetess I visited has revealed that Alina's condition is a direct result of something you did many years ago." The king's brow furrowed in confusion and defensiveness. "What are you talking about, Clara? How can this be my fault?" Queen Clara took a deep breath and told him everything. The beggar woman Charity, the cruel words he had spoken, and the curse she had placed on their daughter. She recounted the prophetess's revelation that only an appeasement at Charity's grave, made by the king himself, could lift the curse. King Donatus stood silent for a moment, his face a mix of shock, guilt, and anger. "This is absurd," he finally spat. "That was years ago. A mere beggar woman cannot curse the royal family. Do you expect me, the king, to grovel at the grave of some long-dead beggar?" Clara stood her ground, her eyes pleading. "Donatus, this is not about pride or shame. This is about our daughter. She is suffering because of something that happened long ago, something you can make right. You may not have known the consequences of your actions at the time, but you can make amends now. If you love Alina, you must humble yourself and ask for forgiveness." King Donatus's pride had blinded him, and he refused to humble himself before the grave of the poor beggar, even though it was the only way to free their daughter from the curse. Queen Clara had pleaded with him, tried to make him understand the gravity of the situation, but the king's arrogance was unshakable. He could not bring himself to bow before the memory of a beggar, even if it meant saving his daughter from a life of suffering. Determined to find another way, Queen Clara returned to the prophetess, hoping there might be an alternative solution. But the prophetess had been firm. There was no other way for the curse to be lifted. However, a different path, one that would make the king understand the full weight of his actions. If the king refuses to seek forgiveness, then your daughter can ask for the curse to be transferred to its rightful owner. Let him feel the shame and humiliation that she has carried all these years. Then, once he experiences the curse for himself, perhaps he will understand. But your daughter must be willing to confront her pain and transfer it to the one responsible. Queen Clara had listened carefully, her heart heavy with the implications. The prophetess instructed her to take Princess Alina to the beggar's grave, where the princess would plead for her innocence and pray that the curse be lifted from her and placed upon the true offender, her father, King Donatus. With a mix of sadness and determination, Queen Clara thanked the prophetess and made her way back to the palace. She knew what needed to be done, but she also knew it would not be easy. Alina had suffered for so long, and asking her to face the source of her torment was a difficult task. But Clara also knew that her daughter had endured far too much pain already, and this was the only way to make the king understand. When Clara returned to the palace, she found Princess Alina sitting in her room, her face still marked with sorrow. She approached her daughter, gently taking her hand. "My dear Alina," Queen Clara began softly, "I have learned the truth about the curse that has plagued you all these years. It is not your fault, and it never was. The curse was placed upon you because of something your father did long ago." Alina looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Father, what did he do?" Queen Clara explained everything. The cruel words King Donatus had spoken to the old beggar woman, and the curse she had placed on him in return. She told Alina that the only way to lift the curse was for the king to humble himself and seek forgiveness at the beggar's grave, but that he had refused. Alina's heart ached as she listened. She had always wondered why her father seemed more concerned with his reputation than her suffering, and now she understood. His pride had blinded him, and she had paid the price for his actions. "But there is another way," Queen Clara said, her voice filled with resolve. "The prophetess has told me that you can go to the beggar's grave and plead for your innocence. You can ask for the curse to be transferred to its rightful owner, your father. Let him feel the shame and humiliation that you have carried for so long. Only then will he understand, and perhaps he will finally do what is right." Alina sat in silence for a moment, her emotions swirling within her. The thought of transferring the curse to her father was painful, but at the same time, she had endured years of suffering for something she had no part in. She had been mocked, humiliated, and shamed, all because of her father's pride. After a long pause, Alina nodded. "I will do it, mother. I will go to the grave and plead for my innocence." The next morning, Queen Clara and Princess Alina set out for the grave of Charity, the beggar. The journey was quiet, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them both. When they arrived, they saw the grave marked by simple stone and written, "Late Charity." Alina knelt before the grave, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the years of pain and shame welling up inside her as she began to speak. "Madam Charity," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I am Princess Alina, the daughter of King Donatus. I have suffered under the curse you placed upon my family, but I am innocent. I had no part in the cruelty my father showed you, yet I have carried the burden of his sin for so long. I ask you now, in the name of justice, to lift this curse from me and place it upon the one who is truly responsible. Let my father feel the shame and humiliation that I have endured, so that he may finally understand the wrong he has done." As Alina spoke, a strange feeling washed over her, as though the weight of the curse was slowly being lifted from her shoulders. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and whispered a final prayer for her freedom. After a long moment of silence, Queen Clara gently helped Alina to her feet. They returned to the palace, their hearts filled with both hope and trepidation. Now, all that was left to do was wait. The very next day, King Donatus called for a public gathering in the royal square. He wanted to address the kingdom, as he often did, to assert his authority and remind the people of his strength. Dressed in his finest robes, he stood before the crowd, ready to speak. But as soon as the people laid eyes on him, a murmur of shock and confusion rippled through the crowd. They stared at the king, their expressions filled with bewilderment and disbelief. "Look at him," someone whispered. "He's half naked." Just as the people had once seen Princess Alina, they now saw King Donatus. No matter how fine his clothing, to their eyes, he appeared tattered and exposed, as though he were wearing nothing at all. The humiliation and shame he had refused to face for so long had finally found him. The king's face turned red with embarrassment and anger as the crowd began to laugh and mock him, just as they had mocked his daughter for years. For the first time, King Donatus felt the sting of public shame, and it pierced his heart deeply. Rushing back to the palace, the king finally understood. His pride, his refusal to humble himself and seek forgiveness, had brought this upon him. He had allowed his daughter to suffer for his own sins, and now the curse had come home to him. As the cabinet chiefs arrived at the palace, they were eager to meet with King Donatus. Word had spread throughout the kingdom about the strange and humiliating transformation that had overtaken the king, and the chiefs wanted answers. They had seen how the princess had suffered for years, and now it seemed that the curse had finally reached the king himself. The chiefs waited in the grand hall for the king to emerge, but as time passed, there was no sign of him. Growing impatient, one of the chiefs sent word to the royal chambers, asking for an audience. The message was delivered to the king, who sat in his chambers, his face streaked with tears and shame. Inside, King Donatus could hardly bear to look at himself in the mirror. To his own eyes, he appeared fully clothed, dressed in the fine robes of his office. But he knew that to everyone else, he looked half naked, just as his daughter Alina had for so many years. The humiliation was unbearable, and he could not bring himself to face the chiefs in such a state. Queen Clara entered the king's chambers, finding him hunched over in despair. She could see the toll the curse had taken on him, but she also remembered the years of suffering their daughter had endured while he had done nothing. "Donatus," she said, her voice firm, "the cabinet chiefs are waiting for you in the grand hall. Why have you refused to see them?" The king looked up, his eyes red with tears. "I cannot face them, Clara. If I step outside, they will see me as I am, half naked, humiliated. How can I, their king, appear before them in such a state?" Queen Clara could not help but laugh bitterly. "Isn't this the same curse that your daughter, our daughter, suffered from for years?" she said. "I found the solution, and you refused to act because of your pride. You could have saved her from this torment, but instead you let her bear it alone. And now, when the curse falls on you, you cry in your chambers. Why are you crying, Donatus? This is your doing." The king buried his face in his hands, his voice trembling with guilt. "I know," he whispered. "I know that it is my fault, but I cannot face them. Tell them I am sleeping. Tell them to go." Queen Clara shook her head, a mixture of sadness and frustration filling her. "You must face the consequences of your actions, Donatus, whether you like it or not. But if you refuse, then I will do as you ask." With a heavy heart, Queen Clara left the king's chambers and returned to the grand hall, where the cabinet chiefs still waited. They looked at her expectantly, wondering what the king's response would be. "The king is resting," Queen Clara said, her voice calm but firm. He will not be meeting with you today. Please return at another time." The chiefs exchanged confused glances, but respected the queen's words. They knew better than to question the authority of the royal family, even in strange times such as these. Bowing respectfully, they left the palace, their questions unanswered. As Queen Clara watched the chiefs leave, she sighed. She knew that the time was fast approaching when King Donatus would have to confront his pride and seek forgiveness at the beggar's grave. But for now, he remained locked away, too ashamed to face the world. Only time would tell whether he would find the strength to do what was right. Until then, the curse that had tormented their daughter would continue to haunt him as a constant reminder of the power of his own arrogance. After 2 days, Queen Clara stood before King Donatus, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and frustration. The king sat slumped in his chair, his face pale with shame and sorrow. He had locked himself in his chambers for days, unwilling to face his cabinet chiefs, the people, or even his own family. The curse that had plagued their daughter for years had finally come for him, and now the proud king was reduced to a broken man too ashamed to step outside his doors. "You must do something, Donatus," Queen Clara said firmly, her voice echoing in the grand chamber. "Unless you want to be dethroned, you cannot stay in hiding forever. A man who appears half naked before his people cannot be the king of this great kingdom. If this curse continues, I am afraid you might lose the throne. The people will not tolerate a king who brings shame upon the crown." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and for the first time King Donatus lifted his head, his eyes wide with fear. The thought of losing the throne, his power, his reputation, everything he had built, terrified him. The kingdom had been his life, and the idea that his people might turn against him because of the curse struck him like a blow to the heart. Tears welled up in his eyes as he imagined himself bowing before a beggar's grave, the very thing he had been too proud to do before. The image of him kneeling in the dirt, begging forgiveness from a woman who had died in poverty, seemed like the ultimate humiliation. But then another image crept into his mind. Him stripped of his crown, his people mocking him, dethroned and disgraced because of his own arrogance. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "You might be dethroned." He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He could see it now. If he continued to let his pride rule him, the curse would only grow stronger. The chiefs would question his authority, the people would laugh at him, and soon they would demand his removal. A half-naked king, unworthy of the crown. "What should I do, Clara?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How can I bow before a beggar's grave? How can I face such shame?" The queen stepped closer, her voice softening but firm. "Donatus, you have no choice. The curse is not about shame, it is about justice. You wronged that woman, and you have allowed your daughter to suffer because of it. Now it is your turn to face the consequences of your actions. If you do not humble yourself, you will lose everything, your throne, your kingdom, and the respect of your people. Is your pride worth more than all of that?" The king closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He knew she was right. His pride had cost him his daughter's happiness and was now threatening his own reign. There was no escaping the curse, no avoiding the past. If he wanted to save his throne and his family, he had to face his shame and seek forgiveness, no matter how painful it might be. "I cannot lose the throne," he whispered, "but to bow before a beggar. It is not the beggar you are bowing to," Queen Clara said gently. "It is the truth, the kindness that you denied her. You must make peace with your past, Donatus. Only then will the curse be lifted." The king wiped his eyes and nodded slowly. The weight of his pride was still heavy on his shoulders. but he could feel it beginning to crack under the pressure of his guilt and fear. He had no choice if he wanted to keep his throne and restore his family's honor. He had to do what he had refused for so long. "I will go," he finally said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will go to the beggar's grave and ask for forgiveness." Queen Clara let out a small sigh of relief. It was the first step, but it was the right one. Now they could begin the journey toward healing for their family. "And for the kingdom, you have made the right choice, my husband," she said softly. "Tomorrow we will go to the grave together, and when this is over, you will be free of the curse." The king nodded, though the fear and shame still lingered in his heart. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but it was the only way forward. His pride had brought him to this moment, and now it was time to set it aside, for the sake of his kingdom, his family, and his own redemption. The next morning, King Donatus and his wife Queen Clara set out on their solemn journey to the beggar's grave. The sky was clear, but the air was thick with the weight of the king's guilt and the hope for redemption. As they reached the grave, the king's heart pounded with both fear and determination. King Donatus bowed his head in deep remorse. His once proud and powerful posture was now humble as he spoke, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Please, dear soul, forgive me," he said softly, addressing the long-gone soul of the beggar, Charity. "I know I wronged you deeply in the past. My pride blinded me, and I treated you unjustly. For that, I beg for your forgiveness. Please, remove this curse from me and my family." As his words hung in the air, there was a moment of stillness. Then, a fresh breeze swept through the graveyard, stirring the trees and lifting the spirits of those present. The wind carried with it a strange, comforting sensation, as though the curse had been lifted, the burden released. Queen Clara, standing beside the king, felt it too. She looked at her husband, his eyes bright with hope. The curse was gone. They returned to the palace in silence, but their hearts were lighter. The moment they arrived, their daughter, Princess Alina, came out to welcome them. King Donatus turned to his daughter, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "Alina," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have wronged you more than anyone. I let my pride overshadow the love I should have shown you. I made you suffer when I could have protected you. Please, forgive me." Tears welled up in Princess Alina's eyes, but she smiled through them. "I forgive you, father. I know now that it wasn't just me suffering, it was you too. I'm just glad it's over." Queen Clara watched the exchange, her heart swelling with pride and relief, and the curse that had haunted them for so long was gone. The queen placed a hand on her husband's shoulder and smiled. That afternoon, the king, Queen Clara, and Princess Alina visited the prophetess who had revealed the truth, offering their heartfelt thanks. "You have saved us," King Donatus said humbly. "Without you, I would have let my pride destroy my family. You revealed the truth and gave us the solution. For that, we are forever in your debt." The prophetess smiled gently and said, "It was not I who saved you, your majesty. It was your willingness to change and seek forgiveness. That is what lifted the curse." As a gesture of gratitude, King Donatus rewarded the prophetess with a large sum of money and treasures from the royal coffers. She accepted the gift graciously, but it was clear that her true reward was seeing the royal family healed. With their hearts light and their spirits renewed, the king, queen, and princess returned to the palace, where they would live in peace and harmony. King Donatus, humbled by the experience, became an even greater ruler, one who understood the power of humility, love, and justice. Queen Clara stood by his side, her wisdom and strength guiding the kingdom. And Princess Alina grew into a beloved figure in the kingdom, admired for her grace and resilience. Together, they lived happily ever after, the shadows of the past finally behind them.